5 years ago, Amelia Sterling stood inside a glittering Chicago restaurant and watched Mason Carter clutch his worn coat while she coldly announced that she would only marry a billionaire. Her friends laughed as the poor single father walked out alone into the rain, carrying a rejection that would follow him for years. 5 years later, Amelia's company teetered on the edge of collapse, and she walked into what felt like her final job interview. The man waiting behind the desk was not some unfamiliar investor. It was Mason, the very man she once threw away like her greatest mistake. If you want to know whether Mason chooses revenge or forgiveness, stay with this story until the very last word. The story began on a cold evening in Chicago inside a restaurant so polished that every glass seemed to hold its own small chandelier. Amelia Sterling was turning 26, surrounded by friends who measured worth in watches and postal codes. Laughter rose easily around the long table, champagne catching the light, and every face there belonged to someone who had never once worried about the price of a meal. Mason Carter arrived quietly, wearing a coat that had seen too many winters. His shoes worn thin at the heel, yet his posture carried a calm that money could not buy. He had not come to ask for anything, and he had certainly not come to be pied. After 2 years of a love kept mostly hidden from Amelia's world, he had come to ask her to marry him. He believed in the plain and stubborn way of a man raised on hard work, that devotion could outweigh distance between two very different lives. When Amelia first saw him cross the room, her face softened, and for a moment, the girl who loved him seemed to outweigh the woman who feared her friends' opinions. But the moment stretched and stares gathered, and someone at the table began to whisper about the plain little box in his hand. Connor Blake, young and confident in the way that only inherited comfort allows, leaned back and remarked that a man like Mason belonged under the hood of a car, not inside Amelia's future. The table laughed, and Amelia's cheeks colored, not from embarrassment for Mason, but from the fear of being seen beside him. Charlotte Sterling's voice echoed somewhere in her daughter's memory, the old lesson repeated at every family dinner, that a beautiful woman should never make the mistake of investing herself in a poor man. Mason knelt. Anyway, ignoring the laughter, and told Amelia plainly that he had no mansion, no yacht, no fortune waiting behind his name. What he offered instead was loyalty and a future he intended to build with his own 2 hands. Amelia looked at the ring, then at her friends, then at the version of herself she was afraid to lose, and she said with a coldness that surprised even her that she would only ever marry a billionaire. The table erupted into laughter once more, sharper this time, and something in Mason's face closed like a door being gently shut. He did not argue. He did not beg. He simply rose to his feet, looked at her one final time, and said quietly that one day she would understand that a person's worth was never written in a bank balance. Amelia turned her face away, pretending the words had not landed, pretending her chest did not ache. Mason walked out of the restaurant and into the rain, his shoulders steady, though something inside him had just been permanently rearranged. That night became the first wound of the story, and without either of them knowing it yet, a quiet vow that would reshape the rest of his life. Behind him, the restaurant carried on as though nothing significant had happened. Glasses refilled, conversation resuming its easy rhythm within moments. Amelia sat rigid in her chair, aware that something important had just walked out the door, though pride kept her from following. Connor slid closer, offering a glass of champagne as if to seal her decision, and she accepted it with a hand that trembled just slightly. Her friends moved on quickly to other topics, treating the entire encounter as nothing more than an amusing interruption to the evening. Only Amelia noticed the small empty chair where Mason had briefly knelt, and only Amelia carried the sound of his voice home with her that night, long after the laughter around her had faded into silence. Mason returned to a small apartment on the edge of the city, where life had always demanded more than it gave back. He carried responsibilities that never allowed him the luxury of falling apart, quiet obligations that kept him moving even when his chest felt hollow. He looked at the cheap ring still sitting on the table. And though no tears came, sleep refused him for the entire night. By morning, he was back at the small repair shop where he worked. Arriving exactly on time as always, his co-workers noticed a stillness in him that had not been there before. A silence heavier than his usual quiet nature. He began taking every extra shift he could find, fixing machines, wiring faulty systems, accepting the jobs other men waved away without a second glance. He was not trying to prove anything to Amelia through words. He wanted to prove it through the shape of an entirely different life. Among his regular customers was an older man named Joseph Reed, who noticed something in Mason beyond simple skill with his hands. Joseph watched him diagnose a broken inventory system in minutes, untangling a problem that had stumped an entire office of trained employees. Joseph encouraged him to study technology, finance, and the mechanics of running a business, insisting that raw thinking like his was rare and worth sharpening. Mason hesitated, ashamed that he had never finished a prestigious degree, certain that such a gap would always hold him back. Joseph told him plainly that diplomas open doors, but competence is what keeps a person standing once they walk through. Mason began studying late into the night after working full days, driven by something steadier than anger. He used the shame from that rainy evening as fuel, but he refused to let it curdle into blind hatred. He told himself quietly that he did not need Amelia to regret her choice. He only needed a future in which he never again had to lower his head in front of anyone. Each night of studying chipped away at the boy who had knelt in that restaurant, replacing him slowly with a man who understood systems, numbers, and the quiet architecture of real power. Joseph became more than a customer. He became the first person to see Mason, not as a repairman, but as someone capable of building something enormous from nothing at all. Joseph often stopped by the shop on quiet afternoons, bringing books on business strategy and asking Mason pointed questions about how he would solve problems most managers avoided. Mason answered honestly without polish, and Joseph began to realize that instinct alone could not explain the clarity in the younger man's thinking. He introduced Mason to a small circle of retired engineers who agreed to review his earliest ideas, offering blunt feedback that stung but sharpened his instincts further. Mason spent his weekends sketching diagrams on cheap paper, building the earliest outline of software meant to catch financial errors before they became disasters. He rarely spoke about the restaurant to anyone, keeping that particular pain folded away where it could not distract him from the work ahead. After turning Mason away, Amelia wasted little time before appearing on Connor Blake's arm at every event that mattered. Connor had the sleek car, the penthouse view, the expensive watch, and a way of speaking that made every room feel smaller around him. Amelia believed with the certainty of someone desperate to be right, that she had finally made the correct choice. Charlotte beamed with pride, telling anyone who would listen that her daughter had escaped the mistake of a poor man's affection. Connor pulled Amelia into a world of investor dinners, champagne toasts, and financial conferences where everyone seemed to already know each other. Beneath his polished exterior, however, Connor was drowning in debt, quietly using new investors' money to patch the holes left by his older failures. Amelia had no idea she was being positioned as a beautiful, convincing face for a company that was hollow at its core. With Connor Unk's connections, she launched a fashion technology startup that gained early attention. Reporters praised her as a rising young entrepreneur, and the praise fed something in her that had always craved recognition. Amelia began to believe she was simply born to stand above other people. Every so often, a memory of Mason surfaced, but she smothered the discomfort quickly, reminding herself that poverty was nothing more than a failure of ambition. Meanwhile, far from any headlines, Mason was quietly laying the first lines of code for a platform meant to help small businesses catch dangerous errors in their cash flow. Two lives moved in entirely opposite directions during those months. One climbing on the strength of appearances, the other climbing on the strength of something real and unglamorous. Neither of them yet understood how completely those two paths would eventually cross again. Connor often introduced Amelia to rooms full of people who spoke in the confident shorthand of money, and she learned quickly how to mirror their certainty, even when she understood little of the details behind it. She signed documents when he asked, trusting the shine of his reputation more than the fine print in front of her. There were nights she caught a flicker of unease watching Connor step away to take calls he never explained. But she pushed the feeling down the same way she pushed down every thought of Mason. Ambition, she told herself, required a certain blindness, a willingness to trust the surface of things rather than dig beneath them. She wanted so badly to be the woman the magazines described that she stopped asking questions that might have protected her. The version of success she was building looked flawless from the outside, yet its foundation had never once been tested. Charlotte visited often during those months, admiring the view from Amelia's new apartment and reminding her again and again how wise she had been to leave a poor man behind for someone like Connor. Amelia absorbed the praise eagerly, letting it smother whatever quiet doubt still lingered beneath the surface. She began appearing at charity galas and industry panels, cultivating a public image built more on confidence than on substance. Reporters loved her story, a young woman rising quickly through a competitive industry, and few of them thought to look closely at the numbers behind her rapid success. Connor encouraged this attention, understanding that Amelia's popularity gave his own shaky ventures an added layer of credibility they otherwise lacked. 5 years slipped by, folding one into the next, until the man who had once repaired machines for strangers became the founder of a financial technology platform trusted by thousands of small businesses. Joseph Reed stood beside him as his very first advisor, watching the boy he had once mentored grow into someone capable of reshaping an entire industry. Investors had once laughed at Mason's humble background. But he turned that very background into an advantage, understanding blind spots that comfortable executives never noticed. His platform specialized in catching hidden fraud inside cash flow long before it could sink a company. The business started with only 3 people crammed into a modest office. No assistants, no polish, nothing but long hours and a stubborn belief in the product. Mason never spent money to appear impressive. He avoided flashy cars, avoided tabloid attention, and instead poured every resource back into making the software sharper and more reliable. His tools saved dozens of companies from collapse by catching discrepancies in their books before the damage became irreversible. Eventually, a major investment fund purchased a minority stake, and the valuation crossed well past the billion-dollar mark that had once seemed unreachable. Mason became chief executive. Yet the simplicity that defined him never faded beneath the weight of his new title. He no longer resembled the man mocked inside that glittering restaurant so many years earlier. Still, the wound Amelia left behind had not entirely disappeared, tucked quietly beneath years of discipline and growth. He did not carry hatred for her every single day, but her name remained a scar he rarely spoke of aloud. Mason instructed his hiring teams that the company would judge people by their skill and their character, never by whatever polished history they arrived with. That single principle, quiet and unremarkable at the time, would soon bring Amelia back into the same room as him. Word of Mason's platform eventually reached far beyond the circles that had once dismissed him, drawing attention from banks, regulators, and business owners who had never trusted software before his came along. He hired carefully, choosing engineers and analysts who valued honesty over flash. And the culture he built reflected the same steadiness he had learned at the repair shop years earlier. Joseph often told newer employees that the company's greatest asset was not its algorithms, but the character of the man who had built them from nothing. Mason kept his old work boots in a drawer near his desk, a small and private reminder of the years before recognition arrived. He rarely mentioned the restaurant, the rain, or the woman who had once refused him. Yet those memories quietly shaped every rule he set for how his company would treat people. He remembered too well what it felt like to be judged by appearance and rather than substance, and he refused to let his own growing company repeat that same mistake toward anyone who walked through its doors. Employees who had once been overlooked elsewhere found themselves promoted quickly under Mason's leadership simply because he recognized effort where others had not bothered to look. He kept his circle of close advisors small, trusting only those who had proven themselves over years rather than through impressive titles alone. Joseph often said that Mason ran the company the way a careful craftsman ran a workshop, valuing precision and patience over speed and spectacle. Amelia's company began to crumble beneath a crisis she never saw coming. Investors pulled their funding and journalists started questioning the revenue figures she had once presented with such polished confidence. Connor vanished during what he claimed was an ordinary business trip, leaving behind a silence that felt almost immediately like abandonment. Amelia soon discovered that many of the contracts Connor had signed carried devastating conditions, leaving her personally responsible for debts she barely understood. Overnight, the woman once celebrated as a promising young executive became someone people quietly avoided. Friends who had toasted her success stopped returning her calls altogether. Charlotte blamed her daughter for failing to hold on to a wealthy man offering no comfort. Only disappointment sharpened into words. Amelia realized slowly and painfully that everything she had chosen for the sake of money was now abandoning her in return. She sold her car, left her luxurious apartment, and cut what little staff remained under her name. A loyal former employee mentioned that a well-known financial technology company was hiring for a partnership management role. The company had a reputation for being difficult to enter, but the salary was enough to help her manage part of her personal debt. Amelia submitted her application without knowing who led the company since its chief executive rarely appeared in the press. She assumed this would simply be one more interview before she lost everything completely. She walked into the glass tower, still dressed in an elegant suit, though her eyes had long since lost their former arrogance. She had no idea that the past was waiting for her on the highest floor of the building. The lobby alone felt like a warning, all glass and quiet authority, nothing like the noisy celebratory offices she once ran. Amelia sat in the waiting area rehearsing answers about leadership and resilience, phrases she had used 100 times before, though they now felt hollow in her mouth. She thought briefly of Mason, the way she sometimes did in idle moments, and dismissed the thought just as quickly as always. A receptionist finally called her name, and Amelia straightened her jacket, reminding herself that she still knew how to walk into a room like she belonged there. Whatever pride remained in her was thin now, worn down by months of humiliation. Yet, she carried it forward anyway, because it was the only armor she had left. The building itself intimidated her in a way few places had before, its quiet efficiency suggesting a level of success far beyond anything she had managed on her own. She noticed employees moving with purpose rather than performance, none of them glancing toward her, the way people once had when she still carried her old title. A younger assistant offered her water while she waited, mentioning almost casually that the company rarely hired outsiders for positions. This senior, Amelia forced a smile, unwilling to admit how badly she needed this particular opportunity to succeed. She thought briefly and bitterly of how differently people had once treated her when her name still carried weight of its own. She reminded herself that survival mattered more than pride at this point in her life, and that whatever discomfort waited inside that conference room could not be worse than watching her savings disappear entirely. A part of her still expected doors to open simply because of who she used to be. And she caught herself more than once having to let that expectation go. The elevator ride upward felt longer than it should have. Each floor passing in silence, broken only by soft instrumental music she barely noticed. Amelia was led into a large conference room where everything felt minimal, elegant, and unmistakably cold. She tried to steady herself, running through the same introduction she had used in countless interviews before. The door opened. Mason walked in. Amelia froze completely, the air leaving her lungs in one silent rush. He wore a dark suit, his posture calm, his eyes carrying none of the uncertainty she remembered from years earlier. She recognized him instantly as the man who had once walked out of a restaurant into the rain. Mason showed no triumph, no mockery, simply taking his seat and addressing her formally as Miss Sterling. That distant professional greeting hurt more than any accusation could have. The hiring panel around them had no idea about the history connecting these two people. Mason asked sharp questions about financial crisis management, executive ethics, and personal responsibility. Amelia answered the technical questions well enough, but stumbled when Mason asked how she repaired a wrong decision after it had already harmed someone else. She understood immediately that his question reached far beyond the walls of any office. She tried saying that everyone makes mistakes at some point in their life. Mason replied that this was true, though not everyone finds the courage to name their own mistake honestly. The room grew tense, stretched tight as a wire pulled to its limit. The interview ended with Mason simply stating that the company would follow up afterward. Amelia left the room with her hands trembling slightly. For the first time in 5 years, she did not see Mason as a poor man beneath her. She saw instead how poor her own character had once been. Riding down in the elevator, Amelia caught her own reflection in the polished doors and barely recognized the tired woman staring back at her. She replayed every question Mason had asked, searching for the version of herself that might have answered without flinching, and found that version painfully absent. Outside, the city moved on indifferent to what had just happened inside that quiet room. Cars and crowds pressing forward the way they always did. Amelia stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, unable to decide whether she hoped for the job or dreaded the thought of seeing Mason again every single day. Both feelings sat heavy in her chest, tangled together in a way she could not easily separate. She walked home slowly that evening, turning over the 5 years behind her with an honesty she had avoided for far too long. Back inside his office, Mason sat alone for a while after Amelia had gone, the room quiet except for the distant hum of the city below. He had rehearsed a version of this meeting many times over the years, imagining what he might say if their paths ever crossed again. None of those imagined versions had prepared him for how hollow victory would actually feel. Joseph found him there later, still at his desk, and asked gently how the interview had gone. Mason admitted that seeing her again had not brought the satisfaction he once expected, only a strange, complicated sadness for the people they used to be. Following the interview, the hiring panel judged Amelia highly capable, though several gray areas in her professional ethics history raised concern. One director suggested rejecting her outright to avoid any risk of unwanted press attention. Mason stayed quiet, turning the decision over in his mind for longer than usual. He had every personal reason to dismiss her immediately without a second thought. Yet he also understood that doing so purely out of old pain would make him nothing more than a more powerful version of the very people who once humiliated him. Joseph Reed gently reminded him of the difference between justice and revenge, a distinction Mason had preached to others for years. Mason found himself remembering that rainy night in vivid detail, the laughter, the ring, the walk home in the cold. He remembered the sting of being turned into a joke for an entire table of strangers. But he also remembered that his rise had never been about making someone else kneel. It had been about refusing to let shame control the rest of his life. Mason decided to offer Amelia a 3-month trial in a role well below what she had originally hoped for. She would be required to join a team helping small businesses recover from financial crisis. Forbidden from using her old reputation or expecting any special treatment. When the offer letter arrived, Amelia felt a strange mixture of relief and shame settle over her at once. She understood that Mason held the power to crush her career completely. Yet, he had chosen not to use it. That restraint hurt more deeply than cruelty ever could have because his decency only made her own past cruelty toward him more visible. She accepted the offer that same evening, uncertain whether she was stepping into an opportunity or into a mirror she was not ready to face. Mason spent that same evening alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the city lights without truly seeing them. He had expected relief once the decision was made. Yet what settled over him instead was something closer to quiet exhaustion. Joseph called to check on him, sensing that the day had cost Mason more than he would ever openly admit. Mason told him that fairness sometimes felt heavier than anger. Though he did not regret the choice he had made, he reminded himself that building something meaningful required rules that applied even when following them was difficult, especially when they applied to the one person who had once hurt him the most. Amelia began her new position on an ordinary operations floor with no private office and no special recognition whatsoever. Young employees around her had no idea she had once been a celebrated chief executive herself. She had to build her own reports, make her own calls, and process raw data without any assistant to soften the workload. At first, Amelia resented feeling reduced to such an ordinary role after everything she had once achieved. But watching small business owners weep with relief because Mason's software had saved them from ruin slowly began to shift something inside her. She met a bakery owner who was on the verge of losing her home because of a dishonest bookkeeper. And Amelia realized, perhaps for the first time, that the numbers on a spreadsheet represented an entire person's life. She had once viewed business only as a stage for showing off her own success. Mason watched her progress quietly from a distance, never interfering directly in her work. He noticed she began staying late, correcting her own errors, apologizing to clients instead of blaming her subordinates for mistakes. One evening, she found him alone in the analysis room, still working the way he had years earlier at the small repair shop. She asked him why he did not simply hire someone else to handle every difficult task himself. Mason told her that real power was never about standing far away from other people's pain. The words settled into her slowly, quietly, without any dramatic reaction. The distance between them had not vanished, but for the first time it was no longer filled only with painful memory. It was beginning instead to be filled with something closer to growth. Weeks passed and Amelia grew close to a few of her new co-workers, none of whom treated her with anything but ordinary friendliness. They had no reason to flatter her, and their honesty forced her to confront how much of her old confidence had depended on being flattered constantly. She began arriving early instead of merely staying late, reviewing client files with a thoroughness she had never bothered with before. A younger analyst once thanked her sincerely for catching an error that would have cost a client dearly, and the simple gratitude left Amelia strangely moved. She realized she had spent years chasing admiration from rooms full of strangers while ignoring the quiet satisfaction of doing careful, honest work that actually helped someone. She began keeping a small notebook of the clients she helped. Not for anyone else to see, but simply because writing their names down made the work feel real in a way applause never had. Some evenings she stayed long after everyone else had left, cross-checking figures twice, unwilling to let a single mistake slip past her again. The version of herself taking shape in that quiet office bore little resemblance to the polished woman who once smiled for magazine covers, and increasingly she preferred it that way. Connor Blake reappeared without warning, having learned that Amelia now worked inside Mason's company. He threatened to leak old documents that would make Amelia look like a willing accomplice in his earlier financial schemes. Amelia panicked, realizing that several papers carried her own signature, even though she had barely understood their contents when she signed them years earlier. Connor also intended to sell sensitive client data to one of Mason's direct competitors. Amelia stood at a crossroads, forced to choose between staying silent to protect herself or confessing everything directly to Mason. This was the true test of her character, far heavier than any interview question had ever been. After a sleepless night wrestling with her conscience, Amelia went to Mason's office and placed every document onto his desk without holding anything back. She admitted that she had once been foolish, arrogant, and too cowardly to question the man she trusted with her future. She told him that if the company needed to fire her or pursue legal action, she would accept it without complaint. Mason studied her for a long moment, recognizing that this was the first time Amelia had stopped chasing a flawless image of herself. He gathered his legal team and launched an internal investigation immediately. They soon discovered that Connor had used Amelia's earlier company to quietly launder investment funds for years. Connor had intended to bring both Amelia and Mason down together in one calculated move. Tension climbed sharply as reporters began receiving anonymous leaks about the unfolding scandal. Amelia spent those days in a strange, unfamiliar state of calm, having already surrendered the fear that once controlled every choice she made. She no longer cared how the story would look to outsiders, only that the truth finally reached the surface where it belonged. Mason's legal team worked through the night, cross-referencing transaction records with the documents Amelia had provided, building a picture far larger than either of them expected. Joseph warned Mason that a public scandal could damage the company regardless of who was ultimately responsible. And Mason accepted the risk without hesitation. He had built his entire company on the promise of honest numbers, and he was not willing to abandon that principle now simply to protect his own image. Late one night, reviewing the growing pile of evidence, Mason found himself staring at Amelia's signature on a document she clearly had not fully understood when she signed it. He recognized with an uncomfortable clarity how easily trust could be exploited by someone skilled at appearing trustworthy. He thought of his own early years when a single wrong signature could have ruined him just as thoroughly. That recognition did not excuse what Amelia had done, but it softened the hardness he might otherwise have carried into the investigation. He resolved to pursue the truth wherever it led without letting old resentment tilt the scales in either direction. An emergency meeting was called, gathering investors, lawyers, and the entire executive board into one tense room. Connor arrived with unshaken confidence, assuming Mason would avoid scandal by quietly blaming Amelia for everything. He presented edited evidence, attempting to paint Amelia as the mastermind behind the entire scheme. Amelia stood before the room, her face pale, but her posture unwavering, refusing to run from what was happening. She admitted openly that she had once been blinded by ambition, signing documents without question simply because she trusted Connor Unk's wealthy appearance. She firmly denied, however, ever intending to commit deliberate fraud. Mason then presented a tracing system his own company had built, designed specifically to follow the true path of financial transactions. The real data appeared clearly on the screen, revealing Connor as the one controlling the flow of funds, forging digital signatures, and creating hidden intermediary accounts. The room fell into total silence. Connor lost his composure and blurted details that only the true culprit could have known. The attorneys documented everything without missing a single word. Investors turned away from Connor almost instantly, their trust evaporating in front of everyone present. Mason refused to turn this moment into a personal act of revenge. He stated plainly that his company existed to reveal the truth, not to destroy people who had once made mistakes. Amelia looked at him with tears in her eyes, though she did not beg for anything. She understood that Mason had just saved her from Connor, yet he had not erased her own responsibility in the matter. Connor was placed under formal investigation immediately. Amelia was allowed to remain temporarily, though she would need to join an ethics recovery program and testify publicly about everything that had happened. When the meeting finally ended, the room emptied slowly. Investors murmuring among themselves as they filed out into the hallway. Amelia remained seated for a long moment, feeling the full weight of exposure settle over her now that the truth had finally surfaced completely. Mason approached her quietly once the room had cleared, telling her that honesty, however painful, always weighed less in the end than the burden of hiding something. She thanked him, though the words felt inadequate against everything he had just done for her. Joseph watched the two of them from the doorway, recognizing that something had shifted permanently between them, something neither revenge nor forgiveness alone could fully explain. Outside the building, reporters had already gathered, drawn by rumors of the dramatic meeting taking place inside. Though Mason's team had prepared a careful statement focused entirely on the facts rather than any personal drama. Amelia declined to speak with the press herself, choosing instead to let the truth stand on its own without her voice attached to it. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly through financial circles. Though the coverage focused mostly on Connor Unke's downfall rather than on Amelia, a small mercy she had not expected. She understood that her own reckoning would come later. Quieter and more personal than any headline could capture. After the crisis settled, Amelia found Mason standing alone on the rooftop terrace of the building. Chicago glittered beneath them. A striking contrast to the heavy silence stretched between the two of them. Amelia did not mention the job, the investigation, or anything related to work at all. Instead, she brought up the restaurant from years earlier. She told him she remembered every laugh, every glance, every word she had spoken that night. She confessed that her declaration about only marrying a billionaire had not only wounded Mason, but had also proven how cheaply she had once valued her own heart. Mason listened without interrupting her once. Amelia apologized, though she did not ask to return to him, and she did not ask for forgiveness right away. She said clearly that Mason owed her absolutely nothing. Mason admitted that he had once imagined the day they would meet again, imagining a moment where she would finally bow her head in regret. But now that the day had actually arrived, all he felt was sorrow for who they both used to be. He told her that forgiveness did not mean forgetting what had happened. Amelia nodded quietly, accepting his words without pushing for anything more. This scene became a moment of healing, not a rushed leap back into romance. Mason confessed that what hurt him most was never her choosing money over him, but the way she had made genuine love feel like something shameful. Amelia broke down in tears at his words. She told him that this was the regret she expected to carry for the rest of her life. They stood together in silence for a while, the city noise rising faintly from the streets below, neither of them rushing to fill the quiet with more words. Mason eventually told her that regret, if carried honestly, could become something useful rather than something that simply weighed a person down. Amelia asked quietly whether he thought people could ever truly become someone different from who they once were. Mason considered the question carefully before answering that he believed it, since he had spent 5 years proving exactly that to himself. He did not offer her false comfort, and he did not pretend the past no longer mattered, but something in his voice suggested a door had not been permanently closed. 6 months later, Amelia still worked within Mason's company, though in a very different role than before. She now led a program supporting small businesses that had once suffered from financial fraud of their own. She no longer appeared in the press through polished, staged photographs, but through the honest results of real projects she oversaw. Mason continued expanding the company steadily, hold only to the same principle of fairness that had built it from nothing. The relationship between them shifted slowly from tension into quiet mutual respect. One evening, the company hosted a client appreciation event at the very same restaurant where Mason had once been rejected. Amelia looked at the old table and felt the entire memory rush back at once. This time, Mason wore no worn coat.
Yet, his eyes still carried the same steady honesty she remembered from years before. Amelia admitted that she once believed a billionaire was simply the richest person in any given room. Now, she understood that true wealth belonged to someone who could lose every ounce of respect from others and still hold on to their own dignity. Mason did not answer immediately. He only said that people could never rewrite their past, but they could choose to stop letting that past write every page still ahead of them. The ending remained open, with Mason and Amelia not rushing toward marriage or romance, but standing instead at the beginning of something new, built honestly upon truth rather than illusion. 5 years earlier, Amelia had wanted nothing but a billionaire's name beside hers. 5 years later, she finally understood that the poor man she once dismissed had not become a chief executive to win back her approval. He had become one because at last he had chosen himself. Joseph, watching quietly from across the room that evening, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile at how far the young man he once mentored had come. Amelia stood beside Mason a little longer than necessary before finally stepping away to greet the guests gathered for the event. As she moved through the room, she found herself speaking with genuine warmth rather than the practiced charm she once relied upon. Later that night, walking home through streets she had crossed 1,000 times before, she felt something unfamiliar settle over her, something quieter and steadier than the ambition that had once driven every choice she made. For the first time in years, she was not chasing anyone's approval. She was simply present, finally, in the life she had actually built. Mason watched the event wind down from near the entrance, accepting quiet congratulations from partners and clients who had come to trust his name over the years. He thought briefly of the young man who had once knelt in this very room, certain that love alone could bridge any distance, and felt no bitterness toward that memory anymore. Instead, he felt a strange gratitude toward the pain that had shaped him, understanding now that it had not broken him so much as revealed what he was truly capable of building. As the last guests filed out into the cool evening air, Mason turned off the lights section by section the same way he once closed up the small repair shop so many years before. This is the kind of story that reminds us worth was never measured by the size of a bank account, but by the quiet strength of character built through hardship. Mason never set out to punish Amelia. He simply refused to let one painful night define the rest of his life. Amelia's greatest transformation came not from losing everything, but from finally learning to see people as more than their circumstances. Real change rarely comes from grand speeches. It comes from small, honest choices repeated day after day until a person becomes someone new. If this story moved you, carry its lesson forward. Never let anyone's judgment convince you that your worth is negotiable. And never mistake wealth for character. True value is proven over years, not declared in a single glittering evening.